Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? My paternal grandfather was an alcoholic wife abuser who regularly cheated on grandma. When my father was a teenager, he stood up to him and threatened to kill him if he ever touched her again. The abuse stopped. Cousin of mine's dad blew his own head off in the horse stall next to him while they were cleaning them. I was told about that at around 15 because I was going to spend some time with them, and was told not to mention their father. Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad. Since it's not a common last name, I thought he was a fan of his work. Because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me. And that's how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half-brother the same age as me. When I was around 3 to 4, my aunt and her 3 sons came and lived with us for a few weeks. One night my mom stayed up and I found her downstairs sitting in a chair looking out the window. One day, my aunt and the boys moved and never came back. Turns out, she was going through a nasty divorce. She had the boys at the house with her while she was packing things one day, and her husband came home. He locked the boys in a room, stabbed her, and then shot himself. My mom had been staying up with a gun that night because she had seen him in our backyard earlier that night. I was told that my mother's older brother had died in an accident. He was intoxicated and got run over by a train. A whole bunch of unfortunate circumstances, etc. My grandmother often mentioned it with sadness, because she considered him a brilliant boy, very handy and had a hopeful career in arts. He was a teenager when he died. However, every time this story came up, my mother's face hardened and she never spoke about it herself. I could kinda sense that there was something left unsaid, but I was a kid, so I didn't really question the story. My mom finally confided in me about a year ago that she was sexually abused by her brother and that it was not an accident, but a suicide. My grandmother has no idea. My grandmother tried to murder my grandfather when she got sick of him beating the shit out of her every day. She swung an axe at him and he blocked it with his hand and lost his thumb. She left him before I was born. My grandfather got out of serving in Vietnam by robbing pharmacies and going to jail for years. When I was about 10, my cousin and his dad died. I always thought it was an accident and on the same day. When I was old enough, I was told that his dad actually committed suicide and my cousin followed him couple months later. Truly devastated me, although I didn't know them well. Edit. Thank you for the warm words and also for sharing your similar stories with me. I've read all the replies. My grief is still there because I understand that with professional help both would maybe still be here today. It just wasn't common to seek help back then. I hope all of you are well. Grandpa died while snorting coke and getting head in his Corvette. My grandfather's brother left the family business after a feud to sell tractor parts to Africa. When I was an adult, I was told these were semi-automatic tractor parts. Grandma had 13 siblings. Of those, 7 women are still alive. Once a year they have a Sister Day, where they all except one are going somewhere to have fun. They've been doing this since they were teens. All but one sister, who has been lied to her whole life about Sister Day, because she thinks it doesn't exist. This is supposed to have been started when that one sister borrowed something and didn't give it back, or something trivial like that. We are all reminded whenever we all get together, pre-pandemic, that we're not to talk about this, because it will hurt that sister. Still can't wrap my head around how backstabbing breachy some family members of mine are, because this is just stupid. My father cheated on my mom, with my sister and I's horse riding instructor. We'd always thought it ended amicably. We only found this out while mom was admitting to having contemplated driving off the road with us in the car as kids, as opposed to raising us as a single mom with no career or stable job. Edit. Added a comma to prevent hilarious confusions. That my cousin was actually my half-brother. Mom got pregnant in college and my aunt and uncle adopted him. And that my dad wasn't my biological father. Mom and dad got divorced. She got pregnant by another man, and my dad wasn't able to have kids of his own, so they got remarried and he raised me as his own. My uncle is believed to have murdered 2 Australian police officers in the late 80s. Not so much let in on, as we found out by accident, but apparently my dad's first love and him got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father for years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad. Even 30 years later, we were always told he was a mentor until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name. And we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with him. My father always tells me as a joke that it's my fault my mom and him are married. I'm the second son. But through the years, from drunk conversations and several sources, have pieced the story together. My parents separated before they knew my mother was pregnant and only came back together after I was born. My grandma retired and she still decided to work for her brother in his restaurant to save up money for when she dies. Funerals are, obviously, Expensive. She insisted he would hold on to her paychecks and pay for her funeral when she dies. He never did. My mom had a brother who died in childhood, maybe 9 or 10. I always thought he drank cleaning chemicals and died that way. But turns out he was hit by a school bus while riding his bike. Now I know why my mom was so anxious about me biking on the road. My grandmother's first husband was extremely abusive. But this was the 60s and he hid it well. She couldn't file for divorce without proof of injury. So she beat herself in the face with a slipper to get away. She was 21 or 22 or so with 3 young children. I'm 23 right now and I could never imagine. She was such a strong lady. I miss her. Less than 3. Edit. Just wanted to say thanks for the awards. I'm glad times have changed for women, but we still have a long way to go. The reason I had a live-in babysitter when I was 5 that moved in at 2 a.m. was because my mom's cousin killed 2 kids and we ended up harboring his daughter during the trial. He's the only person on death row in my county. Apparently my aunt was the product of rape, but my grandma hasn't told anyone in the family yet except me. She just turned 90. I have no idea what I should do with this information once she passes. My uncle and 2 aunts had an incestuous threesome going on in the 70s. They invited my mom, who refused and was pretty horrified. My dad, their brother, had zero idea. I was in senior year of high school when I was told about the family tragedy by my grandparents. My grandfather's brother murdered his wife. She was trying to divorce him and he snapped. He went to jail and their son, my dad's cousin, was alone. He was in high school. My grandparents convinced the deceased mother's side of the family to let them finish raising him and were able to get him back on a good path after the trauma he suffered. He has grown up into an absolutely wonderful man with a wonderful family and I love him. My grandparents spent some time in lockup after my grandpa killed their newborn in a shell-shock-induced frenzy. They were jailed because they buried her body in a cave and tried to hide it. My mom and her siblings were all adopted out very young and went back to their parents around 11 years or so later. I knew that growing up, but didn't know why until I was older. I wasn't actually let in on it. My mother apparently had a miscarriage between me and my older brother. I was supposed to have an older sister. Or maybe I wouldn't be born if she was. I simply overheard her crying about the experience over the phone to my aunt, mom's older sister, and it still bothers her after all these years. They speak Hakka, the main Chinese language Mandarin, which they have come to assume I don't understand but I do somewhat. To put it shortly, my family tree is more like a very long branch. Yes, we have the genetic defects to prove it. My grandfather molested his children when they were young. My aunts and uncle didn't speak about it till they reached their 20s and 30s. They hid their experience to their siblings but little did they know. They all experienced the same thing. They all suffered trauma but didn't tell my grandmother about it because she loves our grandfather very much. My mild-mannered Christian mother casually told me that she dated a gangster who trafficked cocaine in NY during the 80s. He bought her a brand new BMW before getting sentenced to prison for murder for 20+ years. Someone who was friends with her and her ex for years turned out to be an FBI informant and she barely escaped jail. Had to enter a witness protection program and moved cross-country. Here's the craziest part, he's still stalking her, has contacted her on her birthday every year for 40 years, and keeps tabs on her. My dad has no idea. I asked her why she waited so long to tell me. Like, what if she went missing? And she said, "Oh, honey, he's the type of person that if he wanted to harm me, I would already be dead by now." Very comforting. My grandmother's sister, my great-aunt, got pregnant of wedlock. In the 1950s, she was put up in a birthing home and the child was adopted out. She hid the whole thing from her while family minus my grandmother, the eldest of the family of 8 and the one who helped hide her. After she had the baby she came back home after living with her sister for a while. No one knew till about 10 years ago. My mom for him, he is a nice man that had an average childhood with parents that loved him, fortunately. That my grandpa molested all the women in our family, not just me, and they let it happen because that's just what you do. My uncle wasn't missing a ton of birthday parties, family reunions, holiday dinners, etc. when I was a kid because of his really busy job, but because he became a heroin addict after his wife took off with their daughter. My cousin who I've still never met. Edit. Oh yeah, he also tried to stab my aunt, his sister, in a drug-fueled rage when she went off on him about being a bum and exploiting my grandparents. Kindness. My grandpa stopped him but got beaten unconscious in the process. My grandparents' neighbor heard the commotion and had to rush in and stop him at gunpoint. I legit thought he was just a normal, nice guy who I happened to rarely see before I learned all this shit in one night. My dad's sister had a secret daughter that would have been approximately his age. She was 16 years older than him, and the family didn't tell him until he was in college. In their small town, there is a not zero chance he did date his niece. Edit. For those asking, My dad was 3 to 4 when this happened. He remembers a lot of shouting at the time. But not the topic. Also, he is definitely not the baby in question. My mom's bio father lost custody of her in the late 70s during my grandma's and his divorce. She never knew why. Come to find out years later, some kind of freaky porn was found in his possession that caused him to lose custody. My mom then realized that the memories of him staring at her while she was changing and touching her weirdly when she was child meant it was probably CP that the courts found. My parents led me to believe that my grandfather, on my mother's side, had died due to a heart attack. A year later they revealed he actually shot himself in the head. My cousins lived with us for a while and we thought that was fun because it's like a sleepover every day. One time our mom even took us out of school to pick them up. I learned later that it was because Child Protective Services took my cousins away from their mom because of mental health issues. My mom offered to take her sister's kids until she got her mental health back in order. My cousins live with their mom now and their mom is in a much better condition mentally. That schizophrenia ran in my mom's side of the family. I developed it a year after she told me about it at 25. She didn't refer to it as schizophrenia, but as her maiden name. Madness. She said that every once in a while someone in our family would go mad and that's what they would call it. I guess her side of the family also had ties to organized crime and at least one of them was a prostitute. My family never talked about issues or emotions at all, so it was a shock. I assumed our ancestors were relatively normal. But I also thought my family was sane back then too. My dad's uncle died in a boating accident with his cousins. My family let me know he was possibly drowned in the middle of the lake by his cousins because of some money issues. No one was ever prosecuted though and the family is still very close. Weird. My step-grandfather molested my 3 aunties. My eldest sister and possibly my other sister and cousin. Only found out when my nana was dying 11 years after he died. They are buried side by side and I cannot bring myself to go visit my nana because he is there also. Edit. Thanks for all the comments about visiting my nana and ignoring him. I will try. For those saying my nana had to have known, I have discussed this at length with my auntie and we are certain she didn't. She worked nights for many years and my aunties all have told each other they would never have told her as they wanted to protect her. Great uncle was taken from his parents, told he was retarded, wouldn't be right, put in state hospitals, experimented upon. Only thing wrong with him was a speech impediment. My uncle shot a man who was having an affair with his wife. When we was tried, he was let off the hook because the judge was my grandfather's war buddy in WW2. Side note, that judge was also one of the judges in the Manson trials. My grandma actually legally disowned my mother for marrying my dad. The family house was supposed to go to my mom, but after the disowning, grandma didn't say who she wanted house to go to, resulting in a decades-long family feud that has split the family even to this day. Sad thing is, my parents actually ended up divorced after 20 years of marriage. Mom took care of my grandma till the end and was the one who handled the funeral arrangements when my grandma passed 2 years ago. She never asked for the house back. It's worth millions. Nobody told me any of this until I was 30. My dad is in a cult. Wasn't much of a secret. But as a kid you just kinda assume everything your parents do is the norm. Grandma didn't decide to move in with us because she loved us so much and wanted to spend more time with us. Grandma moved in because her son was a meth addict and convinced her to put his name on the house, take all the money out of it, for renovations, and leave her homeless. She had a heart attack the night she found out and now has to live with a pacemaker. Frock you Uncle Roy. When my grandfather died, he wrote his will on his deathbed. He left his entire estate to my family, which was enormous. His wife however, who despised us, in the biggest frock you move I've ever seen, wrote a directly conflicting will, leaving the estate to her family, none of whom I've ever met, and then killed herself. It took around 5 years in legal hell to sort that out. We ended up winning the case in the end, but it cost so much that we couldn't afford to keep his $3 million house anymore. There was a big row with my uncle and another family which often broke into a fight. This was when I was about 10. Never understood what was going on and the scenes always left me shaken. Turns out my 40-year-old uncle got a 16-year-old pregnant that was working for him. My other uncle told me when I was much older. My uncle, my father's brother, used to hit my aunt, and when my mother found out, in the middle of a wedding party, she went straight to beat his ass. People had to break up the fight. I found out because my parents were talking about it as if it were nothing. I was mortified. If I had known what a piece of shit my uncle was, I would have never treated him well, like I did all my life. The worst part is that they're still together. The good part is that I'm proud of my mom. Maybe not as dark as some other stories around here, but it still weighs heavy on my family. My dad had a little sister and she got run over by a car right in front of him when they were on their way to school. She was only 10 years old or something and my dad was around 12. I only found out about it Because I got diagnosed with depression and my mom told the doctor that there is family history of depression. I was underage at the time of the diagnosis, and it's my dad who has depression. Probably because of the accident. My grandparents moved right next to the cemetery where she is buried. I recently found out you can look at her grave from their kitchen window. My father got my mother pregnant when he was her teacher in high school. He was 30 and married. She was 15 and his student. They ran off together. He got a divorce. And they got married in a state that allowed marriage at 16. 2 months before my older brother was born. My mum was raped and my oldest brother is the product of it. We knew my bro was my half. Well, I found that out as a teenager. But my dad told me what happened after my mum died. My aunt started the Communist Party in her country. It got quite large. Her children fled the country. And I still don't know what happened to her. Edit. There's a reason I didn't list the country. Grandma's top secret pie crust was actually just Marie Callender's from the grocery store, set in a fancier dish. She messed with her daughters-in-law for years over it. My grandmother ran off and had an affair, got pregnant, came back to my grandfather and they raised the baby girl together. My father and his siblings didn't find out until they were older. I'm not sure if my aunt knew the truth before she passed away. It's also rumored that there's another half-sibling somewhere out there, so granddad seemed to be having an affair as well. Just affairs all round back in the day. I was never told much, but when I was about 15 my grandmother started getting dementia and had a breakdown. All I could understand was that she kept repeating, "We are traitors." I know she was sent to some sort of children's camp during World War II to be away from the fighting. I think it was called Kinderland. I believe she never saw her parents again and it took decades to find her sister. I will have to ask my aunt one day. Maybe she can tell me more. I have two. The first one being that one of my uncles, who I had spoken to a lot when I was younger, was arrested from having CP. His dad was in a similar spot, and needless to say, after that I lost contact with that side of the family as they refused to tell law enforcement for far too long. The other family secret was my dad had been shot and killed in a different state only a little bit after my birth. Miraculously enough, I never noticed any absence of a father figure in my youth and I just learned about it out of the blue. Not particularly dark. But I was about 45 when I found out my parents never got married. My mother just took my father's surname and they carried on like normal. I'd always wondered why there were no wedding photos, etc. But they were hippie types, so I assumed they just didn't have a traditional ceremony. Weirdest part was it just came out in a random conversation, and they were like, "Oh, we thought you always knew." Well, no. You never mentioned it. All a bit odd, really. Double whammy, I suppose. Didn't look like my parents or siblings, so I thought I was adopted. Ask. Mom brushes it off. Dad does too. Dig. Find some info. Prepare my case. Around the same time I almost get abducted. Super scary. Mom was mortified. After I was sat down and told I have a different father who I look like and he had just tried to abduct me. So not adopted, but man who I thought was my dad wasn't. Good times. My grandfather isn't my biological grandfather. My grandma was raped in high school with her not knowing who the original father was, so the man who would be my grandfather took it upon himself to raise a child. You do not belong to him. My mom is still in love with someone else who was executed when they were 22. My dad cheated on my mom with her sister. Mom committed suicide, presumably holding my hand. I was 1 year old at the time. I hated the ages where I started to learn this stuff. I found out that my dad was very abusive to my mom before they got divorced. Recently found out he may have hit me on one occasion too. Afterwards we lived in a hostel, but a better than average hostel. My dad was in the army. I don't quite understand it, but mad. But it was like a caravan park. I asked my mom not too long ago why we were in the caravan park so long. She then told me we had pretty much nothing and lived in a hostel. I found out my great-granddad was a pedophile who abused my mom. When she told her mom, my nan, she didn't believe her. Kinda think my mom just ain't had a good run. I always thought my Uncle Dan died in a car accident. Turned out he owed lot of money to a loan shark. He and his partner were asked to play Russian roulette and one survives can walk away and get an extension for payment. Uncle wasn't lucky. I didn't have an imaginary friend who moved. I had a twin brother who died from a bee allergy when I was too young to remember much. Great-grandpa was a soldier opposing the Axis powers. Him and his squad were caught by Italian troops and given the death penalty along with his friends. They would be executed together. At the time of the execution all of his mates died in front of his eyes, but he survived because the soldier missed. Without skipping a beat he faked his death by, well, lying on top of his deceased friends' bodies. Surprisingly it worked and he got to escape. Found out about my secret half-brother from Australia once I was in college. When I flew over to meet him, it was like we had a connection that transcended space and time. We majored in the same thing, had the same political views. and had the same role in our respective friend groups. I've always wanted an older brother and imagined what my life would have been with him in it. A couple years later they found he had a brain tumor and he died due to complications of surgery. Life isn't fair. My uncle was a gigolo and he might have continued that line of work as a married man. Proof of this was only discovered by my pops after my uncle's death nearly 30 years ago. My father has declined to talk to my aunt about this. At the funeral of my uncle, I learned that he became a monk after the death of his ex-boyfriend because of HIV. I was 20 at the time, and I never knew that he was gay or had HIV. To me he was just a weird but nice skinny monk I saw just a very few times. When I asked my parents why I have never heard of it, they said it was because I never asked. Which is true. I'm male in my 20s. This is the first time I tell this. When I was 5 years old my cousins from my mother's side sexually assaulted me multiple times. 3 of them were boys, 1 of them was a girl. She was 5 years older. The guys threatened me that they would do something to my sisters if I would tell anyone and if I didn't do what they asked. Then my girl cousin, she was just playing. Or like doing things she saw in movies. Kissing me and touching. I think she got assaulted from her brothers and she did it with me what they did with her and me. It's just a theory since she was a child too. To be honest I got never anyone to talk about it. And I think it been hunting me all the time. And nobody notices it. Guess I'm good to hide it. That my deceased grandfather, who was the only real father figure in my life, and a man I loved deeply, had a consensual incestuous relationship with my mother, and might in fact be my father. I took issue with that because my mother was 15 at the time and no world is that consensual. It completely frocked me up for a long time. I finally ran my 23andMe DNA file through a runs of homozygosity filter and confirmed that he wasn't my father. I still don't know if what I was told was true. My mother drank herself to death at 50 and I had never had a relationship with her. I'm starting to think my family is just boring. Kinda hard to compete with the fascist great-grandfather or the plethora of affairs. My uncle has serious learning disabilities. It turns out that my nan tried to do a home abortion because she got pregnant by some guy while my granddad was away in the army. My great-uncle killed the sheriff of his small town after the sheriff raped his daughter. He hopped a train to Chicago from Tennessee to escape the Klan. He later returned to Tennessee a blind old man at 90 years old. All the files were moved to digital and he outlived all the police who would remember him. Died in 2000. RIP Uncle Blue. This happened in Iraq. My great-grandfather was a frocking psycho. He saw my great-grandmother and approached her parents and told them he wanted to marry her. They refused. So as any normal person would do, he built a brick wall to block off the front entrance of their house. My dad explained that the houses back then only had one door. I didn't get into detail with him about it since this is what my granddad told him at the time. Anyway, he basically trapped them inside their own home until the parents agreed to let him marry her. Later on, when he was in his 90s, he killed 2 home intruders that broke into his house by beating them to death with an oil lamp. Grandfather hadn't died peacefully in his sleep like I was told at 11. He purposefully overdosed on his pain medications after the final fight of his brutally toxic marriage with my grandmother. Left my dad a suicide note and everything. My grandma still doesn't know it wasn't death due to natural causes. Nor do most of my cousins. I was extremely close with my grandpa. Grandma's always been a terrible person and I will always blame her for his death. Just discovered recently my grandma had a 5th child. Put him up for adoption. IDK the whole story as my grandma has passed on. My grandfather's brother suffered from depression. Yeah. Back in the day, that was a pretty big black mark. Psychiatry wasn't what is today, and no medications were available. He was once hospitalized, so that required cover stories. Sorry. I don't know more details. He died before I was born. So these events happened quite a while ago. My dad molested my aunt, my grandma, and my sister. It ruined the family for me at least, and I've not spoken to my dad since and pretty much want to beat the shit out of him. Granddad is gay. Like no shit. He has 6 billion Polaroids of his cat and shares a bed with his best friend for like 40 years. IDK why they even attempted to keep that one a secret from me lol. My parents never married out of love. It was more of a, we kind of like each other and this is pretty convenient thing, and they kept up the marriage until we were old enough to be able to deal with it. I am honestly grateful they chose to give me and my brother a good childhood. My parents were going to abort me, but his friend stopped him. My dad named me after his friend. My dad and I have a great relationship now though lol. My uncle died of a gunshot wound and it was ultimately ruled a suicide. The cops weren't sure though. The circumstances were apparently sketchy, but I don't know the details. The other theory they had was he might have been murdered by some people he did business with who had mob ties. I always had the fondest memories of my great-grandmother. My only memories of her were when she was feeble, lugging around an oxygen tank. but always smiling. She was under 5 feet tall and named after a flower. It wasn't until a few years ago, almost 20 years after her death, that I learned she killed a man and ran from the law when she was much younger. Polish great-granddad was forced to drive trains full of Jews to the concentration camps. I'm told he killed himself because of it. This isn't dark. But my dad was that boring straight-up dad with not a lot of emotion and would scold me whenever he caught me smoking pot. Found out he spent like 3 years following the Grateful Dead and dosing all the time, ha ha ha. Oof. There have been a few. The best ones I can laugh about are: my great-grandma isn't my biological great-grandma. She's her identical sister. A month after my great-grandma died, her husband married her twin. No one talks about this. My kind old great-uncle with dementia was actually an arms dealer who maybe killed 2 people. Still waiting on the full story there. One of my great-aunts got arrested for trying to be intimate with a horse. Mum reminds me most times I go home to visit. At the age of 63, my grandmother found out that the man who had raised her wasn't her biological father. Turns out her biological father had gotten 2 women pregnant in 1943, abandoned them both, and never saw them again. By the time she found out, he had already passed away. The other child he had abandoned? My grandmother's best friend of over 40 years. My grandfather was gay and died of AIDS. He was patient number 17 in NYC in the 80s. I'm 40 now. I only found out last year, as did my 8 brothers and sisters. Quite literally a dark family secret. Being a white-ass blonde-haired blue-eyed little rat bastard at 6 and finding out my biodad is black. Funny enough, my best friend at the time was whiter than me with blonde hair, blue eyes, also had a black biodad. I guess our mums were just super fucking white. My aunt steals desserts from buffets.